Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to have the honour of speaking here at the Buddhist Society, and especially as our subject tonight is one of the most interesting figures, I think, in European thought, Jacob Böhme. As most of you will know, he's widely regarded, together with Meister Eckhart, as one of the two greatest mystical thinkers of Germany. So this is Böhme, pictured in midlife. It comes from an 18th century edition of his writings, and perhaps it's a little bit idealized. He lived from 1575 to 1624, and he was therefore a contemporary of Shakespeare. He, of course, knew absolutely nothing about Buddhism. Europeans at that time did not even know that such a thing existed. Even the very small number of traders and missionaries who were actually in touch with the Buddhist world, in Japan and China, for example, thought the practices they encountered were merely local, and they remained unaware that they were, in fact, in contact with a major religion spread throughout the whole of Asia. So Böhme was a Protestant, a sincere Lutheran, and in conformity with this, he very often speaks of God. And when we delve into his thought, we find that what he means by God is something very different from the creator God of conventional Christianity. He lived for almost the whole of his life in the old town of Görlitz. It's a little to the north of Prague and east of Dresden. And at that time, it was a part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's now right on the German-Polish border. It's on the river that divides the two countries. Böhme was fully aware of the suffering and strife around him at that time, as Christian Europe was breaking up into fiercely competing sects. And the 30 Years' War, which would devastate Germany, began some 6 years before Böhme died. He grew up almost as a peasant and earned his living by making shoes. But he was hard-working and resourceful. This is the house in which he lived and worked. He was neither rich nor poor. He was careful to provide for wife and children. And had one encountered him in the street, one would probably have dismissed him as just another plain, straightforward citizen. Yet at the same time, Böhme was both a religious mystic and a powerfully original philosophical thinker. He was, in fact, of immense importance for German thought. Hegel called him the first German philosopher. Schopenhauer placed him, along with the Upanishads and Plotinus, as a source of the highest knowledge to which mankind can attain. And in England, translations started to appear within 25 years of his death, notably those of John Sparrow and John Elliston, which were published in London during the time of Cromwell. And these are the translations that I'm going to use tonight, since they best preserve the strange vocabulary and the rough energy with which Böhme writes. As John Sparrow notes, so these excellent notions might not be slipped over as men do in common current English, but that the strangeness of the words may make them a little stay and consider what the meaning may be. As a member of the artisan class, Böhme had received little education, but he made himself familiar with many of the ideas of his time. He was almost entirely self-taught. But ever since boyhood, he had had powerful visionary experiences in which the world seemed transformed, appearing for a short time to be bathed in divinity and in light. Heaven has revealed itself within my spirit in such a way that I there recognized the divine works and creations he wrote. As a result, he felt driven all his life to seek, with remarkable courage and persistence, beyond the framework of conventional Christian belief, for the truth about the world and about its relation to final reality, or God. And not just in theory, but in a way that would bring about a profound change in self-understanding, a dramatic alteration in our very nature and in our experience of the world. Böhme saw men and women as half-dead angels. That's his phrase. Spiritual beings who had somehow lost their own nature, and in many cases sunk to the level of animals, and sometimes savage animals. We have written this work, he says in the preface to one of his books, not for the irrational animals who in their exterior have the form of man, but in their image, in spirit, are evil and wild beasts, which is disclosed and exhibited by their properties, but for the image of man, for those who are budding forth out of the animal image, with a human image that belongs to God's kingdom, and would fain live and grow in the human image, in the right man. The human image, the right man. That was what Jacob Böhme sought to find and restore. In his first book, called The Aurora, or Dawn, he tells of the beginning of his search. I fell into a great melancholy and sadness when I beheld the mighty deep of this world, for I saw evil and good, love and anger in all things, in the earth and its elements, as well as in man and beast. In this affliction, I wrapped up my whole heart and soul, together with my thought and will, in the resolution to struggle with the love and mercy of God, without ceasing until he blessed me. And when I stormed so hard on God and all the gates of hell, as if my life depended on it, and I had still some reserves of strength, suddenly, at a violent assault, my spirit burst through the gates into the innermost birth of deity. And there I was embraced with love, as a bridegroom embraces his bride. It was like the resurrection from the dead. In this light, my spirit saw through all things and into all creatures, and I recognized God in grass and plants. As we see here, Böhme was in some respects a nature mystic, but he was also a sincere Lutheran and regularly attended the Protestant church in Görlitz. But his searchings and insights did not fit easily into that framework, and throughout his life he was fiercely opposed and persecuted by his Protestant pastor, a man named Gregorius Richter, who reacted to the publication of Böhme's first book, The Aurora, with these words: "There are as many blasphemies in this shoemaker's book as there are lines. It smells of shoemaker's pitch and filthy blacking. May this insufferable stench be far from us. The Aryan poison was not as deadly as this shoemaker's poison." They didn't mince their words in those days. In a way, Richter had a point, because some of Böhme's ideas certainly challenged Lutheran doctrine, and sometimes Christian teaching as a whole. He did not accept the important Lutheran doctrine of salvation by faith alone, sola fide, nor the teaching that the creation of man was ex nihilo, out of nothing. God, for Böhme, is very far from being an unmoved mover, a changeless reality standing outside the world and apart from the human soul, and creating these out of nothing. Christianity sometimes seemed to Böhme to have lost touch with its own depth. In the greatest part of the books of the divines, he writes, there is nothing but the history that such a thing has been done, and that we should be regenerated in Christ. But what do I understand from this? Nothing, but only the history that such a thing ought to be done. Our divines say that men must not dare to search into the deep grounds of what God is. Men must not search nor curiously pry into the deity. Well, the question driving Böhme and giving his writings their dramatic power is one which had long haunted Christianity. How could a loving God have made the world we live in so full of strife and suffering, where blind, impersonal forces appear to prevail? Because of his limited education, the struggles of the theologians with the problem of evil were of no help to Böhme. I can do nothing, he writes, with their methods and their formulas, since I have not studied by them. I have another master, and that is all of nature. In nature and its creative force, I have studied and learned my philosophy, my astrology and my theology, not through the mediation of men. Nature and its creative force. That is the centre around which Böhme's thought revolves. Unlike many other mystics, his starting point is not transcendent reality or a creator God, but the world in which we live, and the way in which it may be transformed by a change in our own being. It was in this world that he had seen the veil of matter grow thin to reveal the divinity shining through beneath it. But human beings had lost contact with their own divinity, he thought. Paradise is still on earth, he writes, in the signature of all things. But man is far away from it, so long as he is not regenerated. Böhme believed that ideally, the ultimate mystery, the origin of things, should not be inquired into at all. It lies too far beyond our understanding. And yet, since sin has now arisen, we must know how it arose, or we cannot discover the remedy. We have to find out, he writes, from whence and by what means evil has come to be in the devils and in man and in all creatures. For such untowardness is found to be in all creatures, biting, tearing, worrying, and hurting one another. Everything is so at odds with itself, as we see it to be, not only in the living creatures, but also in the stars, elements, earth, stones, metals, in wood, leaves, and grass. All of nature was alive for Böhme, driven by some inner creative power. But the result of this ceaseless activity, this mercurial wheel of nature, as he calls it, is often conflict and suffering. Therefore, Böhme concludes, we have no alternative. We must open the mystery of the process of manifestation and find for ourselves why this is so. And it is possible for us to do this. As we have come out of the divine, we can penetrate back into it, he thought. For every spirit, as he puts it, can seek back into its own mother. He sets about this task with an originality and daring which might well have got him into greater trouble than it did. At the same time, he is aware of the inadequacy of his exposition. He ceaselessly warns his readers that, on account of human limitation, he must describe as a process in time that which occurs in eternity, as it were, simultaneously in the eternal now, and has to set side by side things which are in reality mutually dependent and joined together in an unbroken unity. Underlying nature and its creative force is what Böhme speaks of as the Ungrund, that is to say, the groundless, the non-being, that beyond which there is and can be nothing else. He calls it the abyss, and thinks of it as a void out of which all issues. Here, God, in his ultimate nature, is the eternal silence, the all and the nothing, neither darkness nor light, manifest to none, not even to himself. Böhme writes, "He is not this and not that, neither evil nor good, love nor anger. It cannot be said of God that he has distinction in himself, for he is natureless, emotionless, creatureless." The Ungrund, then, is the primordial condition which precedes being. It is therefore without substance, nature, or qualities of any sort. In this initial stage, the divine is spoken of by Böhme as the eternal nothing, the still rest, the repose without being, die Stille ohne Wesen. From a Christian standpoint, it might be said that Böhme has abolished the ideal of God, in spite of retaining the word, and substituted for it an ineffable ultimate reality about which nothing can be said or known or thought. An abyss, as he calls it, an emptiness. And we are reminded of the final reality of negative mysticism, of Eckhart's words, "If there were a God of whom I had any idea, it would not be worth having him as God," and of the not this, the neti of the Upanishads. Yet we see at this point how different Böhme is from earlier mystics in the Western tradition. For the Ungrund does not satisfy Böhme. It may be the ultimate truth, yes, but from the standpoint of the world we are in, it is of little use. It tells us nothing about manifestation or the arising of evil. That which is without nature profits me nothing. I could, to all eternity, neither feel, nor see, nor understand it, he writes. And he is convinced that nothing can come forth out of an absolute unity. Manifestation lies before us. It is a fact. And for manifestation to come into being, there must be difference. A second and contrary principle must be present. If the abyss, the Ungrund, is the source and cause of everything, Böhme argues, it follows that within its essence there must lie, if only in latent and potential form, some plurality, some dark force of difference from which a beginning can be produced. God, in his ultimate nature, cannot be a static perfection, as theology teaches, for out of absolute unity no multiplicity can come. There must lie within God some seed of differentiation, not only a yes, but also a no, as Böhme puts it. He writes, "The reader must know that all things, whether godly, devilish, earthly, or whatsoever it may be called, consist in yes or no. The one, as the yes, is virtue and life, and is the truth of God, or God himself. But God would be unknowable to himself, and would have in himself no joy, perception, or exaltation without the no. The no is the opposite to the yes or the truth. In order that the truth may be manifest as a something, there must be a contrary therein." Thus Böhme concludes that the basis of all things, the Ungrund or abyss, is not a static perfection, not a principle of pure transcendence, but a being or power, a will, which is full of movement and energies, and in which the contraries of good and evil are already contained in principle, though not yet in actuality. It's important to understand that this is not will in the limited sense in which we know it in which we know the will in ourselves. That is merely the tip of the iceberg. It is will in the sense of cosmic life force, the creative principle of the universe, the essence even of inanimate nature, as the alchemists had maintained. Everything in nature is alive, or at least has life locked within it. Even the rocks, Böhme thought, are a kind of willing. All things are generated out of will, he writes, for will is the master of every work. It has its origin out of God the Father towards nature, and passes through nature, back to his heart again, and this is the end of nature. In short, the world is brought about by that will or God which, flowing outward, manifests as nature, but may then be transformed and rise again out of nature and return to the heart of unmanifested being. Thus there are in effect two wills, two directions. And so we find that ultimate reality is for Böhme a dynamic, ever-changing process. The world is simply will in a manifested and materialized form. He writes, "The coming into being of the whole creation is nothing else but a manifestation of the all-essential, unsearchable God. All things are sprung forth out of the divine desire and created into an essence or state of being." The admission of a duality already contained, at least in principle, in the ultimate reality, enables Böhme to explain the presence of evil and pain in the world in terms that seemed more convincing than Christian theism had been able to offer. He sees that without evil there could be and would be no good, just as without shadow no light can be experienced. That imperfection, and hence evil and suffering, is in fact the very condition of manifestation. Ohne Qual kann keine Offenbarung sein, he writes. Without pain, no manifestation can come into being. For there can be no manifestation without difference, and difference implies that there must be some imperfection. Hence, a manifested world is necessarily an imperfect world, containing things which are good and things which are less good, and hence bad. To complain that the world is imperfect is simply to say that it is not the unmanifested ultimate reality. If everything were perfection, how could there be light and shade, good and bad, big and small, high and low. Everything would rest in the primordial state. If God is to be known, or to know himself, manifestation, and with it grades of being, good and bad, joy and suffering, is indispensable. The desire to good, Böhme writes, and the desire to evil, both must be, or God would not be manifested. Nothing in nature is to be rejected, or all would remain a still nothing. God can come into manifestation only through a contrary, an opposite principle in himself. Böhme put it in memorable words: without poison there can be no life. And so, like some of the Gnostic thinkers centuries before him, Böhme comes to the conclusion that there are two wills. But they are not, as the Manichaeans, for example, thought, two opposed principles of being, one good and one evil, forever in strife. Both wills, for Böhme, both wills are God, just as we find both wills in ourselves. There is a dark will and a light will. The dark will is what he calls the nature will, painful, restricted, greedy, asserting itself. It is the outward-going will, the will to manifestation. He writes of tearing oneself away from the will of God. Using Christian terminology, no wonder his Lutheran pastor was shocked, he calls the outward-going will the Father, and the light will opposing it and leading to reintegration with the divinity he calls the Son. In his book, The Signature of All Things, he writes, "The being of all beings, that is to say, God, is but one only being, but in its generation or manifestation, it separates itself into two principles, into darkness and light, into sorrow and joy, into evil and good, into anger and love, into fire and light." Is the source of suffering and evil, therefore, to be found in God himself, in the very nature of the ultimate reality? Böhme thinks of himself at all times as a Christian, and although he comes perilously close to admitting that it does, he just manages to avoid this. He does so by arguing, perhaps a little speciously, that good and evil lie in God, or rather in the primordial non-being of the Ungrund, but only in potential, as possibilities, and not as actualities. They have not yet separated. They are not yet good and evil, but an equilibrium of mutually opposed yet complementary forces held together in harmony. They are not yet kindled, as Böhme puts it, not made actual. They become actual only in the process of manifestation. Böhme calls these two fundamental principles of divine being, without which there could be no world, the anger and the love of God. The anger is what he calls the first principle. Here, the love and light of God are hidden. It is the outgoing will which moves away from the initial unity, the will in all existence to assert and preserve separate, independent being. But the will of life, he writes, broke itself away from the divine essence and went into experience and perception, out of unity and into multiplicity, and resisted the unity, which was the eternal rest and only good. The anger, then, is the destruction of the primordial unity, and leads into what Böhme calls the dark world, the world of strife and struggle, of unredeemed nature, of blind struggle in the darkness of ignorance. The second principle is the will which is opposed to this, the will to return to the initial unity, after having passed through what Böhme calls the beast-like will of the self, and having turned away from it. It is the ingoing will. He calls it God's love, and sees it in terms of light, flowing both from and towards God. It is a total turning away from the assertion of separateness and individuality, the assumption of a new identity. Here, Böhme says, light is manifest, and darkness and anger are hidden. This opposition of the two wills in the being of God also takes place in the human soul. For the soul is, in fact, in Böhme's words, God's own substance. It is not a kind of being different from God, he says, but on the contrary, it is fundamentally the divine substance itself. And, endowed with its own primordial freedom, it brings into reality the latent and possible opposition between good and evil. Böhme writes, the inner essence of the soul is the divine nature, and is neither evil nor good. But in the kindled life of the soul, the same will divides itself. It is itself its own cause to good and evil. For it is the centre of God, where God's love and anger are latent and undeveloped in one essence. In this sense, mankind is the centre of nature, as he puts it, where light and darkness divide. And Böhme cries, understand, he is no separated spark, like a part from the whole. He is no part, but the whole altogether. It's important to grasp that the second principle, the ingoing will, is not a different world, but a change in the way in which we see and experience the world. And behind this lies a distinction which was important to Böhme between two different mental faculties. Just as we have two eyes, which enable us to perceive spatial depth, so we have two modes of knowing, one to see the surface of the world, and the other to pierce below it. These two different modes of knowing are reason, the German word is Vernunft, and understanding, or Verstand. At first sight, they might seem to be almost the same thing, but Böhme, and after him many other German thinkers, saw in them a difference of the first importance. Reason, or Vernunft, for Böhme, is that power of thought which is capable of analysis, information processing, problem solving, mathematics, logic. The word reason derives from a Latin verb, reri, meaning to count, and ratio was originally the faculty of counting. So it is conceptual thought, seen as a more or less mechanical brain function. It was exclusively on reasoning of this type that Descartes, a few years after Böhme, built up what he called his new system of knowledge. It is, of course, immensely useful in relation to the world, but, Böhme writes, it comprehends nothing of the kingdom of God, but only the husk. It is restless, and always goes round in a circle on the outside of things. It gives us only external dead nature, not the movement within nature, the spirit, the life of the will, it provides a partial truth, and therefore a superficial truth. And when cut off from the understanding, it leads to evil. On the other hand, the understanding is that faculty which grasps meaning and values. It is concerned not with logical connections, but with what things are in themselves. It is the power of choosing, discriminating, deciding, which in medieval philosophy was referred to as the intellect. It seeks the underlying reality beneath the external appearance. Thus Böhme sees the world in terms of an outer shell and an inner being. The whole outward visible world, with all its beings, he writes, is a signature or figure of the inward spiritual world. Both reason and understanding, then, are ways of apprehending the world, but they give us very different worlds. This double vision gives to Böhme's universe a depth of meaning and a tense dramatic interest not possible to either faculty or I alone. When God reveals himself to man, he writes, then he is in two kingdoms and sees with twofold eyes. We have seen that Böhme posits two eternal principles, an outward-going force, a nature will or own will, which gives birth to the struggling natural world, and an inward-going or reconceived will, which leads back towards unity and divine joy. However, one of Böhme's most significant books has the title, The Three Principles of the Divine Essence. What, then, is the third principle? It is, he tells us, the life of the soul. It is this present world of good and evil mixed together, where the two wills, the yes and the no of God, contend and struggle. This is where the battle rages, and Böhme speaks of it as fire. It is both God's anger fire and God's love fire, simultaneously the source of burning pain and of light and purification. Mankind was placed, Böhme writes, between the two kingdoms of light and darkness, free to choose. So he lives in two principles, both of which draw him and desire to have him. In the fierce principle or source, whose origin is the darkness of the abyss, and in the divine power or virtue, whose source is the light and the divine joy in the burst open gates of heaven, he writes. Thus is man drawn to both and held by both. But in him stands the centre, which holds the balance between the two wills, the original outward-going will and the reconceived will to the kingdom of heaven. For the mind is the centre of the scales. The thoughts are the weights that pass out of one scale and into the other. For the one scale is the kingdom of the fierceness, the one scale is the kingdom of the fierceness and of anger, and the other is the regeneration in heaven. Thus men and women may choose the own will or the resigned will. The first, he writes, tears itself from the entire will of God and brings itself into selfhood, wherein there is no rest. With the second, man becomes the image of God again, for his will falls back into the unsearchable will of God, out of which he came in the beginning. In another place he adds, let each one heed what he does. Each man is his own God, and also his own devil. As he inclines to, or gives himself, unto either of these principles, the same impels and leads him and becomes his master. One of the things which makes Böhme's writing difficult for us today is the fact that he uses alchemical imagery to describe the movements of the will. As far as we know, he was not a practicing alchemist, but there is no doubt that he knew much about it, and that its imagery was intensely meaningful to him. It is found throughout his writings, and often takes the shape of what he calls the 7 nature forms. Descriptions of these are found time and again in Böhme's works, as he traces the working of the 3 principles. 3 nature forms constitute the dark world of the first principle, which, as we have seen, Böhme calls the anger of God. Here the nature forms clash, struggle, coagulate, and alter one another, as do sulphur, salt, and quicksilver in the alchemist's retort. All is at the mercy of impersonal forces. It is the struggling nature will known to science and to reason, to Vernunft. 3 more nature forms comprise the second principle, the polar opposite of the first, in which the world is seen transformed and bathed in the light and love of divinity. It is the world of which Böhme knew the reality in his visionary experiences. And between these 2, a single nature form, the human world, corresponds to the third principle. It is here, Böhme taught, in the human soul, that the great transition can be made, and the dark, suffering world of the first principle, of the own will, and of nature red in tooth and claw, can be transformed into a paradise, bathed in the light of love, bathed in the light and love of God, of final reality. It is like the sudden reversal of a magnetic field. Böhme calls it the Schreck, or the Blitz, the sudden dramatic flash of illumination, like a bursting or explosion, in which what had been seen as the real is suddenly known to be unreal, and what had been unreal is found to be the real. Then the sting of death is broken, Böhme writes, and there rises in nature the other will of the Father, which he drew prior to nature, namely his heart of love, the desire of love, the kingdom of joy. In a short work called Of the Supersensual Life, Böhme has a dialogue in which he makes it clear that salvation lies in a change in our willing, an ending of the nature will, or own will, and its replacement by what he calls the resigned will, or God's will. He tells us that the result of this surrender of the own will is a changed vision of the world. For what we know is dependent on the state of our being, and when the understanding of our own nature changes, the world also changes for us, and we see it with new eyes. We may get some idea of this if we consider the experience of what we call beauty. This comes about when what comes before us, often it's just an effect of light, very often, when what comes before us is so overwhelming that for a brief time we entirely forget about ourselves. We no longer think of the possible effect on our own well-being, as the subconscious mind does almost continually. Instead, we are entirely identified with and open to what lies before us. We are merged with it. There is no residue of self-interest, and we have, for the moment, forgotten ourselves. The world is transformed, and the bliss which results in that moment is what we call beauty. For Böhme, this transformed vision of the world was the great salvation, the idea of which sustained his life and which he sought for others. And in spite of the limits imposed by his background and environment, he arrives in the end at a conclusion entirely at one with the visionary thinkers of other cultures. Here, for example, are the words of a Japanese scholar, Gajin Nagao, writing on the Yogacara thinkers of India, who lived about 1,000 years before the time of Böhme. Nagao is describing the sage who has attained a vision of the world free of what the Yogacarans called the imagined nature, or parikalpita svabhava, that we habitually superimpose on the world, and seen now as it truly is in its purified or consummated nature, its parinishpana svabhava. These are the words of Nagao describing this state. The sages and enlightened ones also live in this one unchanged world. For them too, summer is hot and winter is cold. Willows are green and flowers are red. Due to their deep insight and detachment, however, only the pure and real world is manifested to them. The imagined world does not appear. It is in this sense that the one unchanging world is referred to as possessing a consummated, a parinishpana nature. It is consummated in the sense that it has assumed a nature of perfection owing to the long assiduous training of the enlightened sages. In other words, the consummated world is established anew by them. It is not established independently outside of this world. It is the very same world, thoroughly transformed and purified. It is the same for Böhme. As the individual nature is transcended and the own will is transformed into God's will, the world is changed, and the half-dead angels, which are men and women, recover their true being, their right image. Böhme expresses this renewal, this birth of the spiritual life, by means of a beautiful simile. As a fair flower, he writes, grows out of the rough earth, which flower is not like the earth, but declares by its beauty the power of the earth, and how it is mixed of good and evil. So also is every man who, out of the animal, wild, earthly nature and quality, is born again, so as to become the right image of God. Thank you very much.